the end of our last segment, we asked the question how long the peace of Nicias, which ended the Archidamian War, would last. The answer is not long. In this portion of the lecture, we're going to touch on the renewal of hostilities in the Peloponnesian War. Then we're going to turn to a new theater of war far from the Greek mainland, and that is Sicily. This geographical shift should and indeed does strike us as surprising. And in focusing on the Athenian Sicilian expedition, we will discuss how it came about, what happened during it, and how it affected the Athenian war effort. Now, the Peace of Nicias was really only an interruption, whole sequence of events of the Peloponnesian War. And that is why I agree, and we should agree with Thucydides, that we're not dealing with two separate wars, Peloponnesian War Minor and Peloponnesian War Major, but rather that we're dealing with just the one that was interrupted by a couple of years of hiatus and hostilities. It was an ominous sign that some Peloponnesian states were unhappy with the terms of the Peace of Nicias, and that Corinth, Megara, and Boeotia didn't sign it. Moreover, Sparta didn't return Amphipolis to Athens, nor did Athens return Pylos to Sparta, both of which each side was supposed to do under the terms of the peace. Now, in Athens, a war faction was growing to dominance, led by a new character in our saga, Alcibiades. And it was this war faction that countered Nicias's passive group. Alcibiades is one of the more colorful characters in the Peloponnesian War and indeed in Greek history. He was an aristocrat. He had a family connection to Pericles even. He was stupendously wealthy. At one time, he entered multiple teams in the Olympic chariot race event, and one had to be fabulously wealthy to do to enter in even one team into the chariot race, let alone multiple ones. So very, very rich. He was also quite young, and he lived an ostentatious party lifestyle, kind of like a bête noire of Athenian society, like one of those Hollywood teens or people in their 20s that one hears about guzzling gallons of champagne and doing all sorts of illicit behavior, too much money, too little brains, and no responsibility. Well, Alcibiades was elected strategos in 420 BC, and one would think that because of his aristocratic background, Thucydides would give him a good press, but actually the reverse is the case. As I mentioned in our previous lecture on rhetoric, Alcibiades was eager to win military glory for himself. And although he was an aristocrat, Thucydides seems to have viewed him as really no different from the other demagogues like Cleon, whom he obviously hated, because Alcibiades was pursuing a policy that was in his own best interest, not the well-being of Athens. In Alcibiades' case, as I said, he was after military glory, and this was clearly something that he would never achieve while Athens wasn't at war with someone. So he had an obvious motivation for renewing hostilities. Clearly, Alcibiades and Nicias were headed for a showdown at some stage. We might even expect one of them to have been ostracized. We should remember how Cimon had gotten rid of his rival Themistocles, for example. But while there was an ostracism in 418 BC, for some reason, neither of these two men, neither Alcibiades nor Nicias, were ostracized. Instead, that dubious honor fell to a rising demagogue named Hyperbolus, who was by trade a lamp maker. Perhaps the groups attached to Alcibiades and Nicias couldn't get enough ostraca with each other person's name on them prepared in time. Perhaps the people simply couldn't choose between the two, but whatever the case of that may be, both Alcibiades and Nicias continued to advise the assembly, and it was the oratory of Alcibiades that finally won out. Incidentally, the ostracism of Hyperbolus in 418 was the last time the Athenians would ever hold an ostracism. In 418 BC, thanks to the activities of the dissatisfied Peloponnesian allies, not to mention Argos, Alcibiades was able to persuade the Athenians that Sparta had broken the peace of Nicias. In 418 BC, hostilities proper resumed again. Over the next few years, both sides, Athens and Sparta, lost and gained ground in turn. But then in 416, a sequence of events began that would result in the war taking a dramatic turn for the worst for the Athenians. And that is because they became embroiled in Sicily, And it is to Sicily that I want to now deal, and especially the so-called Sicilian Expedition in detail. In the winter of 416 BC, an embassy from the town of Egesta, which is over here in the western spur of Sicily, went to Athens to request assistance in a conflict that it was having with its southern neighbor, Selinus. Selinus was an ally of Syracuse, and we've met Syracuse before. You remember this was a colony of Athens's enemy, Corinth, and Corinth was an ally of Sparta. Corinth was the largest and most Syracuse was the largest and most powerful polis in Sicily. And this all meant that if Athens agreed to support Egesta against Selinus, then they would be taking on Syracuse. And because Syracuse would naturally help out its ally Selinus against them, this might in turn bring in Corinth, which would of course bring in Sparta. So this was all a big mess of tangled alliances. But it was just the perfect opportunity that Alcibiades was waiting for, because he wanted his military glory. What is more, the Egestans sweetened their request by offering to pay for the entire cost of the Athenian expedition. So the assembly voted that a reconnaissance mission, a fact-finding mission, we might call it nowadays, should be sent out to Egesta to see whether this Athenian expedition was indeed worthwhile. In other words, to find out whether the Egestans could really afford to pay for it. This Athenian mission was apparently very impressed by Egesta's wealth, and on its return, the ambassadors reported very favorably to the assembly that that in no uncertain terms, Egesta seemed extremely wealthy, and that there should be no problem whatsoever in funding Athenian help to the plans. What this assembly did not know was that they had been duped. The people of Egesta had collected together all of their valuable objects, and they filled a house with them. The Athenian diplomats then went into that house, and they saw how apparently wealthy the household was. But as they left, the Egestans behind them quickly took the same objects and put them in the next house, and then again in the next one, and so forth, so that every house the Athenians visited gave this impression that everyone living in Egesta must be loaded. Really, the Athenians weren't very observant if they kept on seeing the same things over and over again. Whatever the case of that may be, this is the story as Thucydides tells us. In Athens, an assembly was held about whether to help Egesta. This would mean taking on Syracuse as well. And the Athenians were aware of this. Alcibiades and Nicias were both strategoi in that year, and Thucydides tells us, he gives us, rather, what he says are their speeches. Now we have to remember, Thucydides was exiled in 424 BC. And we're now in 416 BC, so Thucydides is very much relying on hearsay when he gives us their speeches. And you must also remember what I said earlier, that he was not averse to manipulating what the speakers said to make his own points. Nicias spoke against supporting Egesta on the very real grounds that Athenian involvement would be costly, that the Athenians would have to split their forces, and that this wasn't very clever, as they were still at war with Sparta. Moreover, Nicias said, even if Athens were successful in Sicily, it was so far away, and it would add so little to the Athenian empire that they need to keep a kind of permanent garrison on the island to ensure its loyalty. And he was right about that. Nicias also attacked Alcibiades personally for his youth and his motives in wanting Athens to commit to the expedition in the first place. He said to the Athenians that Alcibiades was only after his own personal glory, and again, he was right in that. Then Alcibiades gave a speech in which he rebutted many of Nicias's personal comments, such as his ostentatious display of his wealth, and Alcibiades exhorted the people to vote for the expedition. Rhetoric was effective, and it caused Nicias to give another speech in which he tried to use scare tactic rhetoric on the people by saying how much they would end up having to spend from their own pockets after all, and the potential losses for manpower that an expedition to Sicily would bring. In fact, it was Nicias who gave us a context for when Athens recovered from the plague, because in one of these speeches at the assembly, at the debate in the assembly, Nicias said, "It's only now that we've recovered from the plague." And that this is now 15 years after that plague. So, the plague ended in 429, and now we're in 415. I'm sorry, 414. So it really shows you that it took 15 solid years for the Athenians to recoup their manpower losses from that devastating plague. Well, what Nicias said was to no avail. The crowd at the assembly, carried away by Alcibiades' oratorical prowess, voted to send not 60 triremes that Alcibiades had asked for, but 100 triremes. Command of this expedition was split among 3 commanders, Alcibiades, Lamachus, and Nicias. Nicias's inclusion is surprising, since he was against the venture from the very outset, but perhaps he was made a commander as a check on the younger and more rash, impetuous Alcibiades. The speeches of Nicias and Alcibiades that Thucydides gives us, as I've mentioned before, cannot be verbatim, because Thucydides was exiled from Athens in 424, and for the rest of the war, he simply traveled the Greek world collecting stories for his account of it. And what is more, this debate, the Sicilian debate as it is known, is unique in Thucydides' history because he gives us 3 speeches from it. He doesn't give us his usual pair, that is, one person speaking for something and another person speaking against it, as with the Mytilene debate, where Cleon stood opposed. In the Sicilian debate here, we have a speech against the expedition by Nicias, then we have one in favor of it by Alcibiades, and then we have another one by Nicias, also against the expedition. And nobody, as far as I know, has really gone into why Thucydides gives us 3 speeches. But what I do know is that Thucydides doesn't do this sort of thing without a reason. He's a very careful author. And I think Thucydides wants to build up for us just how disastrous the people's decision will be, because the people vote to send this large fleet to Sicily, and Thucydides wants us to focus on Nicias's caution, which in the end, with the benefit of hindsight, will be justified. Thucydides gives us 2 speeches from Nicias, and in effect, he's giving the people 2 chances not to go to Sicily. But even hit with those 2 speeches from Nicias, who makes extremely good points in them, the mass of the people in the assembly are still carried away by Alcibiades' performance. So once again, Thucydides' contempt for how the people handled their political power and his highlighting of the flaw of direct democracy shine through. Now, the Armada that was sent to Sicily was ready to set sail in 415 BC. But on the morning of its departure, 2 acts that were considered very blasphemous were discovered that compromised it. First of all, the Athenians woke up to find that the herms had been mutilated. Now, herms are square stone pillars atop which sat a bust that is of the god Hermes. And these herms also basically were like good luck symbols. They were placed in front of houses and temples, at crossroads and along roadsides to, it was believed, protect travelers, because Hermes was the god of travelers. Since the head of Hermes was on each pillar, the herms were considered sacred. And that meant that however they were mutilated and whatever things were lopped off of them and kind of smashed, this meant that this mutilation was a sacrilegious act. However, given Hermes' attributes, the god of travel, the vandalism was also seen as a bad omen for the Sicilian expedition, and the fleet was immediately put on hold. Again, then we can see that religion went hand in hand with Greek political life, and we've seen many examples of that. Now, the second thing, I said there were 2 putatively blasphemous acts. The second one was the profanation of the mysteries. The mysteries were a religious cult that took place at Eleusis, which is a town to the west of Athens. Everything to do with it was secret, hence the name mysteries. Only those who were initiated into the cult knew what went on at them. It had an air of mystery about it, forgive me. Something akin to what, I don't know, the Masons do or something like that. Whether an outsider infiltrated a meeting of the initiates, thereby compromising this secret sect, or whether someone parodied what the initiates were supposed to be doing when they got there, is not exactly known. But needless to say, given the religious significance of these mysteries, they were connected with god Persephone, goddesses Persephone and Demeter. It was thought that the god would have been offended Indeed, anyone who violated such secret cults was open to prosecution. There's actually an example of Aristophanes, the playwright, who parodied some of the rites in this cult quite inadvertently in one of his plays, and he was brought up on charges for this. Now, although there was no evidence against him in particular, Alcibiades' enemies blamed him and his youthful gang of friends for the mutilation of the herms and the profanation of the mysteries. The Athenians viewed impiety very seriously, and this was still definitely in an age, the Greek pagan imagination firmly believed that if the gods were displeased with an individual, if a town or a city had failed to punish somebody who had acted so blasphemously, then disaster could await that entire community, in the form of plagues or famine or whatever. So Alcibiades faced a severe penalty, even death, as if he already were found guilty. He immediately demanded to be tried, but an assembly debated the matter, and that assembly could not find any evidence against him, so it was decided to let him sail with the fleet. After all of these shenanigans, the great fleet finally set sail, and it picked up more ships and men from allies as it sailed to a stopping off point at Corcyra, and then the whole armada sailed across the Mediterranean, consisting of 134 triremes and around 25,000 soldiers. These were supported by 130 ships carrying supplies. This was an enormous force, enough to take on half a dozen Sicilies. It crossed the Mediterranean and it put in at Rhegium, which is in southern Italy, at the toe of Italy. And there it was discovered that the Egestans had lied about their wealth, that they were unable, after all, to pay for the cost of the expedition. And this was a massive blow to morale, because as Thucydides says, this fleet was the most expensive ever put together. And to make matters worse, the three commanders couldn't agree on a plan of action for some time. Odysseus advised going to the aid of Egesta against Selinus, in keeping with the original intent of the mission, and then going home. Alcibiades wanted to try to win over as many Sicilian cities as possible with a view to taking on Syracuse in the end. Lamachus, on the other hand, was in favor of attacking Syracuse presently, right at that moment, before the Syracusans could properly deploy their own considerable fleet. Lamachus was very much the junior member of this trio. He seems to have been disregarded by the other two. So when nobody listened to him, he threw in his support behind Alcibiades. But it's about this time that Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to stand trial now for his alleged role in the mutilation of the herms and the profanation of the mysteries. Clearly, his enemies had found it easier to disparage him when he wasn't there, after he had already left Athens. After his enforced departure, he went home. He went back, at least. He left at that moment. After his forced departure for Athens, Odysseus and Lamachus continued to disagree about what to do. The result was that the Athenian fleet did nothing for the rest of 415 BC, and very little for 414. However, in that second year, 414, the idea was obviously formed to besiege Syracuse. And to this end, the Athenians began to build a wall to the west of Syracuse on a plain called Epipolae. The idea being to use this as a defensive wall for their land army to besiege Syracuse. But at the same time, their fleet would blockade it from the Syracuse harbor. That is perhaps why in 414 BC, we have an embassy from Syracuse going to Sparta, asking for help against the Athenians. And guess who also lent their voices to Syracusan request? Corinth, because Syracuse, as I said, was a Corinthian colony. So what had started off as a separate undertaking from the Peloponnesian War to help Egesta and potentially conquer Sicily and so add it to the Athenian Empire had now blown up in the Athenians' faces. The costliest expedition ever was now part of the Peloponnesian War, and to make matters worse, the Syracusans didn't take too kindly to the Athenians building that wall to the west of Syracuse and launched an attack on the Athenians themselves, during which Lamachus was killed. That meant that supreme command was now in the hands of Nicias, the man who, ironically enough, had been against the expedition in the first place. And he'd hardly performed brilliantly elsewhere, remember. His lackluster effort in Sphacteria, you recall, was what started off that whole drama. I wonder whether any Athenian remembered the second of Pericles' strategies at this point, not to expand the empire until the war was over. And I wonder if they did not wish that the clock could be turned back. Whatever the case, if that may be, the recall of Alcibiades at such a critical juncture in the Sicilian campaign was not only disgraceful on the part of the Athenians, given the assembly had found there was no evidence against him previously, but it was also very stupid. The recall of any general at such a critical moment would be very stupid. And it is another example of how the mass of the people were swayed by the rhetoric of speakers, in this case, Alcibiades. Pericles was obviously just a name by now, and his strategy had long been disregarded. Needless to say, Alcibiades saw the writing on the wall. In other words, he knew that he was going to fall victim to trumped up charges in a trial, especially as most of his support base was now in the Western Mediterranean with the fleet. Alcibiades took the only course open to him, and it really shows you just what a moral kind of tragedy he is as a person. He went to, he escaped from his escort back to Athens, and he fled to, no less, where he began to intrigue with the Spartans against the Athenians. They had treated him so contemptuously, we really can't blame him, but it really does show you what a tremendously kind of moral chameleon he was. And apparently his way of life back in Sparta. So while he was in Athens, he was a friend of Socrates. He would stay out late drinking and carousing, talking philosophy and stuff like that, and being a proper sophisticated Athenian, if somewhat wild. When he was at Sparta, he totally shifted gears, was up at the crack of dawn, exercising in the nude with all the rest of the Spartans, lifting weights, jousting with a spear, and doing sword practice, and all the rest of the stuff that the Spartans did all along. So, acting like a true Spartan. It really shows you how. And this is, we have not met the end of his career, by the way. We will see ultimately. We'll even go further outside the Greek world and try to fit in there too. But anyway, back to Sicily. We've got Lamachus dead. We've got Nicias in sole command. Once Nicias took the bull by the horns, and he ordered the fleet into the harbor of Syracuse. And this bold move took the Syracusans a bit by surprise, and it would have lessened the odds of the Athenians quite a bit as well. But then the tables turned dramatically for Syracuse, and the odds on the Athenians went sky high. The Syracusan embassy to Sparta had met with success, after all, and it was aided in its quest by Corinth's diplomacy and also by Alcibiades, who was now actively working for Sparta, in Sparta. The Spartans now made an alliance with Syracuse, and they sent a general by the name of Gylippus and a force to Syracuse. Within days of arriving at Syracuse, Gylippus and the Spartans had formed a joint plan with the Syracusans that undid all of Nicias's good work. They attacked the Athenian forces at Epipolae, and they built a counter wall to that of the Athenians, the ones that the Athenians were still actually trying to build. This meant that the blockade of Syracuse in the west was now impossible. Gylippus, interestingly, is a fascinating character in some ways. He's a product of the declining number of Spartiates. And let me explain what I mean by that. As we know in Sparta, only those who had graduated from the Academy and could maintain their Sicilian dues were homoioi, or equals. Anyone else was an inferior. But manpower problems meant that the Spartans had to rethink some things. And one thing was whether they needed to make adjustments to their society. We find the rise of a group of Spartans at this time called Mothakes. These are either Spartans who could no longer maintain their Sicilian dues, or, and this is interesting, they were the children of Spartan fathers and Helot mothers. Gylippus was one such Mothax, that is the singular of Mothakes. And here he is, not a lowly soldier pressed into service, but the general in charge of the Spartan army in Syracuse. And that speaks, I think, very, very strongly about just how big the manpower problem was. Now, Nicias sent a letter to the Athenian assembly requesting that he be relieved of his command. He apparently did have some kidney disease, so this is perhaps legitimate. But he also said in the same letter that Sicily was a lost cause, and that if the Athenians wanted to take the place, they would need to send out another force as big as the first one. He's probably not exaggerating here. it sort of reminds me of how, the Americans at the start of the Vietnam War, although they never mentioned this publicly, it was revealed in documents that were leaked later on, the so-called Pentagon Papers, that they understood perfectly that the war was unwinnable from its very, and that short of a nuclear annihilation of the North, there would really be no way of. This is basically the same kind of thing here. He understood that uh, uh, that this was a lost cause, and that maybe using such strong language would make the Athenians see sense. They would realize that the time had come to cut their losses. That would be the prudent thing to do. But, and you're probably tired of hearing about this, the assembly didn't see sense. They didn't recall Nicias, and they were swayed yet again by the oratory of the rhetores in Athens, the demagogues, and the Athenians did exactly what Nicias said to do, basically as a point of hyperbole, and they sent another expedition, a second one. And this one was under the command of Demosthenes, the fellow who was of Sphacteria fame. The second fleet arrived in the year 413 BC, and it hit trouble immediately. While trying to take Epipolae, Demosthenes was soundly defeated, and he immediately decided that the time was more than ripe to get there. And this would have been music to Nicias' ear, especially as Gylippus, the Spartan commander, was increasing his own force daily with reinforcements from elsewhere in Sicily, and also the Peloponnesian League allies. But then nature intervened. As the Athenian force was getting ready to set sail, a lunar eclipse occurred. Thucydides says that the Athenians, who always looked for signs like this in the heavens, they interpreted this eclipse as a sign that they were to stay, and they were to stay for 27 days. Thucydides talks about 3 times 9, and you can't tell me that's 27. Nicias, who was very superstitious and believed in omens, announced that he was going to follow the advice of those who had interpreted the eclipse as meaning they should stay for another 27 days. And as a result, the Athenian fleet stayed where it was in the harbor of Syracuse. This was the chance the Syracusans had been waiting for. It blocked up the entrance to their harbor so that the Athenian fleet could not put to sea, even if it wanted to. And then the Syracusans attacked the Athenians and their allies with all they had. In a series of engagements in the great harbor of Syracuse, the Athenians and their allies were completely defeated. Those who survived the battle, some 40,000 of them, including Demosthenes and Nicias, swam for safety from their sinking vessels, but the only place they could swim, of course, was to the shores of Sicily. In effect, given the power of Syracuse in Sicily, not to mention the presence of the Spartan army there, the Athenians were fleeing through enemy territory. So they were running through the Sicilian countryside, trying to get away from their manifold enemies, and they were hunted down. Slaughter, we are told, was terrible. Thousands of them, including Demosthenes, were killed at the hands of the Syracusans and the Peloponnesians. These people relentlessly pursued them. They fired arrows at them. They speared them as they ran away. At one river crossing, the river Asinaras, so many Athenians were massacred that the water ran red with blood. And we are told that the men were so thirsty after having run for so long with no water that they, even though the river was filled with gore and blood, they continued to drink it. They were suffering from such great thirst. And Thucydides says that it was at this river that the greatest number of men in the entire war died in one spot. This was the point where Nicias surrendered to Gylippus, offering his own life if Gylippus would order the massacre to end. And Gylippus agreed. The remaining Athenians were then taken captive. The Sicilian expedition was over. How would the horrific news be received in Athens? And what was going to happen next? Well, we'll answer those questions in the next portion of the lecture, which will also deal with a period of oligarchy in Athens, an oligarchy that arose because of the failure of the direct democracy